With a driver, this car weighed 1,415 pounds. This is the most insane thing I've ever experienced. This is so damn cool. Hi everyone, I'm Kenan from Cars and Bids, and today I'm in Los Angeles at the dealership Specialty Car Collection to talk about something crazy. This is a real Formula One car. It's the Caterham CT03 from the 2013 Formula One World Championship, and today we're going to be discussing all of its facts and figures. First, we'll take a general look at the history of this car and where it fits into Formula One's past. Then we are going to get very nerdy and talk about all the technical details of the CT03. Before I get going though, what this actually is a surprise. This Caterham is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is chassis number 5, which was raced in the 2013 Formula One season by Gato Vandergaard, and it was driven at the US, Malaysian, Chinese, Australian, German, and many more Grand Prix. It's also finished in the Caterham livery of that year, and well, it's a Formula One car. And so after you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below where you can head to the live auction of this one, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. And we begin the story of the CT03 by first discussing Caterham Formula One team. If that name sounds familiar, that's because they also made road cars. They were purchased and folded into an entity called Caterham Cars, and they had the Caterham Road Car division, and they had a Formula One team. The Caterham Formula One team took over from Lotus F1, and they raced from the 2012 until the 2014 season, when they folded. This car, the CT03, took over from the previous generation Formula One car from 2012, the CT01. With this car, Caterham wanted to achieve reliability. Their previous season had been relatively decent with the best place finish of 11th, and they wanted to improve on that, and they set out to do so with this, the CT03. For the 2013 season, Caterham signed 2 drivers, French driver Charles Pic and Gato Vandergaard, who drove this particular chassis. 2013 would also be a pivotal year for F1, as it was the last year of naturally aspirated V8 power, as in 2014, the formula would change to a twin turbocharged hybrid drivetrain. And for that final year, Caterham really wanted to achieve reliability. That was the whole focus of this particular car. Caterham is a very small Formula One team, and so they didn't have the money to develop an engine and gearbox on their own, and so they would license these parts from another manufacturer. In the case of the engine, they licensed it from Renault, and the gearbox came from Red Bull. But they developed the chassis and the aerodynamics for this car specifically to compete for the 2013 season. Unfortunately, Caterham immediately ran into controversy with their exhaust design. James Allison noticed that the exits for the exhaust system looked to be conical in design, which was outlawed in Formula One. And so Caterham was investigated immediately for the use of a conical exhaust design. As a result, they had to go back to the drawing board and redesign parts of the system in order to comply with Formula One rules, adding to the woes as this car was already relatively difficult to drive. Initial testing of the car in Barcelona proved to be difficult, as drivers were having difficulty coming to the grips of how the car handled. Very quickly into the Formula One season, an update would come as well that would change the way this car looked. A vanity panel was added to the front of this car, which changed the look dramatically mid-season, but it would be taken off again later in the season, and the car was raced as you see it here. Vandergaard himself said that the front end of this car was too strong and the rear was too weak. They simply couldn't strike the right balance with it. Although a mid-season update would come along that would make the car better, ultimately it wasn't as competitive as the previous generation CT01. The best result for this car was 14th compared to the previous year, where the best result was 11th. Even so, this car remains an important piece of Formula One history, as it took part in that final year of naturally aspirated V8 power. Okay, it's time to get nerdy, and we're going to begin by talking about the aerodynamics of the CT03, as that's one of the most important parts of any Formula One car. The first element I want to talk about would be the very front of this car, which uses the stepped nose design. It's very obvious from where I'm sitting. This section of the nose is much lower than this section of the nose, and they have, well, a step between them. The reason for this design is that Formula One cars preceding this one were getting taller and taller, meaning that there was less and less visibility out of them. For safety, the sport dictated that teams had to provide better visibility for their drivers, and this provided a bit of a problem. Teams could either redesign the entire chassis of their cars, or they could come up with a creative solution, and being Formula One engineers, that is exactly what they did. The step design is what Formula One teams came up with. They also would cut out the center section of this particular design so that the driver could see the front of the car, giving them better visibility and complying with Formula One's regulations. As I mentioned previously, midway through the 2013 season, this car would receive some aesthetic changes. Most notably, it would receive a special treatment to the front end, which kind of dialed down this step design, but they would revert back to this design later in that season, and that's exactly how you see this car today. The next piece of aerodynamic design we have to talk about this car would be its side pods. Located on either side of the driver, there are these extrusions which allow for air to flow into the engine bay, and they become called side pods. With this particular car, the design was different for the 2013 year, as they were much more cut away at the bottom than they had been on the previous CT01. In the era of this car, the CT03 would also receive vertical flow conditioners, which is Formula One speak for these little vanes that are located here on top of the side pod. Again, the idea being to redirect airflow in this particular area. While I'm in this area of the car, the next thing I want to talk about would be the T-tray or floor that's found on this car, as it's massive and incredibly flat. The most interesting part to me, though, would be the multiple weaves of carbon fiber you find on this thing. Closer to the body and in high potential impact areas of the car, there's a very thick weave of carbon fiber that really looks more like a racing flag or a checkerboard than it does traditional carbon fiber. Along the edges, you have a much finer weave of carbon fiber, which allowed engineers to make specific shapes to suit the aerodynamic needs of this car. When you see a Formula One car on TV, of course you know it's made out of carbon fiber, but you often lose the impression that there are multiple weaves of carbon fiber and even more exotic materials involved in these cars' construction. But when you get to sit this close to one, it's incredibly obvious. Moving to the front of the CT03, I wanted to talk a little bit about the front wing on this car, as it's incredibly complicated. Now, it wasn't that big of a change for this car over the 2012 car, but it's amazing the level of complexity of carbon fiber work that you find up here. There are two details that I really like. The first would be this little vane here that's located at the very top of the wing. It is so small and delicate and subtle, but engineers must have thought that it made a difference, and that is exactly why you find it here. I also love this relief cut that's located here on the side of the front wing, as it allows air to flow through this particular carbon fiber structure and out the other side. These are the sorts of details that you lose on TV, but when you're sitting next to a Formula One car, are really impressive, and they are everywhere on this thing. The next thing I want to talk about with this car would be its rear wing. You have a GT3 RS or an F40 and you think that your rear wing is cool. It is, but this is a rear wing. Formula One design since 2013 has changed a lot, and it's very clear that we are in a completely different era now than we were back then. During this era, the focus with wings were narrow and tall, whereas now wings are much lower and much wider. However, there is technology back here that we still use today, and of course I'm talking about DRS, or the drag reduction system. If you're unfamiliar with Formula One, the way it works is that when a driver is in a certain part of the track, they're allowed to activate DRS, which moves this flap on the wing, allowing for more clean airflow over the back of the car. This is valuable in areas where you don't want lots of drag, most notably on straights where you want to go extra fast. The idea was that by incorporating a piece of the wing that could move, cars could go even faster, so we would have even more overtaking action as fans, because that was a common complaint among spectators of Formula One. We still use DRS in Formula One cars today, but in 2013 it was relatively new, as it made its appearance in the sport first in 2011. Regardless, it's something we still see on Formula One cars today, and it's cool to see it up close and personal with the CT03. While I'm at the back of this car, we have to talk about its engine. Now, it's important to note that this particular car doesn't have a drivetrain in it at the moment. It's a rolling chassis as it stands, but this car comes from a very important time in Formula One history. After this car, Formula One switched away from naturally aspirated power. They would add instead turbocharged hybrid drivetrains to cars, and so this comes from the end of the line for the naturally aspirated Formula One car. This car was powered by Renault, more specifically the RS27 2.4-liter V8 that revved to 18,000 RPM. It produced about 750 brake horsepower, 80 of which was provided by the KER system of this car, the kinetic energy recovery system, which allowed this car to harvest energy under braking and deploy it at the will of the driver. Being a Formula One engine though, of course, it wasn't just focused on outright power, it was also insanely light. It weighs about the same as I do, 209 pounds, and that's because this engine was comprised of a lot of exotic materials. The block and heads are made out of aluminum, which is what you would expect, but the connecting rods were made out of titanium. The crankshaft was made out of nitride aluminum alloy, and they used tungsten counterweights in its construction as well. And the result is that this engine was insanely light. But then again, so was the rest of the car. With a driver, this car weighed 1,415 pounds, which is incredibly hard to comprehend if you're used to street cars. The result is that this car could get from 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds. And admittedly, while a Tesla Model S Plaid can get to 60 even faster than that, which is an impressive feat on its own, this is a Formula One car, so it can go much faster through the corners, and straight acceleration isn't necessarily the focus of this car. Regardless, 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds is still an insanely fast figure. Another note on how light this car is, it's extremely easy to move, especially with no engine. So light that you can just slide it around, which is insane that you can move an entire car just like that, but that's how light a Formula One car has to be. The next thing I want to discuss with the CT03 would be its suspension design. Now, as you expect with a Formula One car, this has a pushrod activated suspension, which means that it transfers the load into the middle of the car, enhancing its handling. It also has a double wishbone suspension design, which is what you would expect for a Formula One car, but this one is particularly interesting as it's an unparalleled wishbone setup. Most double wishbone setups are basically mirror images of one another, where the top wishbone looks very similar to the bottom wishbone, but in this car, they're not parallel. They're slightly different designs, and the idea behind this was to increase the contact patch of rubber on the road. This suspension design allows for camber gain as the car drives around, meaning that you maintain more rubber on the racetrack than you otherwise would. This is really important because at low speeds, the aerodynamics aren't generating grip anymore. It comes down to mechanical grip to get you through the corners. And so the more rubber you have on the racetrack, the better the car will handle and the better your lap times will be. Caterham would use the suspension design in order to maximize this car's grip at low speeds. It's a relatively unusual design to see on any road car, but it makes a lot of sense in racing applications, and so, of course, you see it here on the CT03. All right, now it's time to do something I have wanted to do my entire life. I've been a Formula One fan forever, but I've never been able to sit in an actual Formula One car, and so I'm going to jump in. Hunter is behind the camera, so I'm gonna actually get in a Formula One car. So I just walked through the technique. So you take, the first thing you do is you step into the car, minding the mirrors. Then you sort of walk forward a little bit and you put your feet in first and you kind of lower yourself down, into the, oh my God, down into the car. It's so low. This is the lowest thing I have ever been in. And then you take the steering wheel. There we are. And you put it on and you're in. I'm sitting in a Formula One car with my feet on the pedals. This is the most insane thing I've ever experienced. This is so damn cool. And you really get a sense of what it's like to be in one of these cars, like on the racetrack. Like the visibility is wild. Just to see those tires, like I've seen from so many helmet cams watching Formula One. This is one of the coolest things I think I've ever done. Initial impressions I have is, one, it's relatively comfortable. Now, admittedly, I am too fat to fit in the seat that came with this car, and so we had to take it out, which is pretty common. You have a custom seat made for you if you're driving this sort of car. But it's surprisingly comfortable. You are sat right on the ground, but I was always led to believe that your rear would be much lower and your feet would be much higher, but that's not really the case. They actually come like pretty straight out, and I'm surprised at how comfortable it is. The other thing I have to say is the throttle pedal. To have my foot on the throttle pedal of an F1 car is really cool, but the brake, oh my God, the amount of pressure it takes to press the brake is outrageous. I suspect even with all the strength I can muster, I suspect it probably wouldn't be enough to sufficiently slow this car down. I thought my foot was resting on like part of the car, not on the brake pedal. But that's how stiff the brake pedal is in a Formula One car. Regardless, This is such a cool view, and I'm just geeking out as a Formula One nerd. And now we move on to talk about the steering wheel a little bit in here, as it's, well, the main control you have to look at. And I don't know what every button does on here, but there are a couple that I want to go over. The first one would be the paddles located on the back of the steering wheel. At the bottom, you have the clutch paddles, which is how you initiate the clutch when you're doing the start of this car at the very beginning of the race. Above those, you have the up and downshift paddles, your upshift on the left and your downshift on the right. They're magnetic paddles, and the tactile feedback you get from them is amazing. I could sit here and play with it all day long. But then we want to focus on the buttons that are in this car. On the right, you have the pit limit speed, which this is a speed limiter that you have when you enter the pits. There are speed limits inside the pit lanes that you don't want to exceed because you'll be penalized. And so there's a pit button here that you press to limit the RPMs of this car so you don't accidentally overexceed that when you're in the pits. The button below that would be the wing button, and this is how you activate DRS on this car. When you're getting to a straight and you want to go extra fast, press the wing button and it opens up the DRS. On the left side, you also have the KERS button, which activates the kinetic energy recovery system. Press that button and you get that extra boost of power when you need it, as we talked about earlier. In addition to all these buttons, you also have a series of dials located on the steering wheel to adjust a bunch of different aspects of this car. You can adjust the brake bias, you can adjust the amount of torque this car is making, you can adjust the RPM, everything can be adjusted here on the steering wheel. It's pretty amazing. My favorite button of all, if you're a Formula One fan, you know, would be the drink button. You'll know the quote, "You will not have the drink." And to see the drink button staring back at me is pretty crazy. But this steering wheel is very straightforward. It's amazing the number of things that you have to control and think about as a Formula One driver. In addition to being competitive and making sure the car gets to the end of the race, you just have tons of stuff to play with in here. And to see it in person and actually press all these buttons, which feel absolutely amazing, it's really cool, and it brings Formula One to life for me in a very, very real way. All right, it's time to get out of the Formula One car, which I suspect will be more entertaining than it will be for you than it is for me. The first thing you have to do is release the steering wheel. So you pull back on this quick release here, which is this yellow release, and it comes right off. You then very carefully set it on the car, and then it's time to get out. The way you do this is you work yourself back first with your feet to kind of get some leverage, and then you push yourself up on the car and you stand up. It's actually not as bad as I thought it was going to be getting in and out of this car, but it does require just a little bit of finesse. And that's how you get in and out of a Formula One car. And that is the Caterham CT03 Formula One car from 2013. I'm a huge Formula One fan, but when we started Cars and Bids, I never in a million years thought we would have an F1 car on the site. But alas, we do, and you can bid on this one and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you very soon. Goodbye.